Well, good morning, folks. Welcome to the latest edition of our Election Science Office Hours, which is a webinar and podcast hosted by the Lynn Center for Science, Society, and Policy here at Caltech and moderated by me, Michael Alvarez. You'll find our archive that now has 18 awesome episodes available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and they're on our Caltech Election Integrity page at our website at protectingtheelection.us. Please be sure to follow us on social media. We're on LinkedIn, X, Blue Sky for the latest updates on our work and for the recording, the archival recording of this conversation. Today, I'm so excited because our guest is Justin Levitt. Justin's professor of law and the Gerald T. McLaughlin Fellow at Loyola Law School here in LA. And the topic for today, we've got quite a few people who are joining us live. It's a really timely topic, and we're going to talk about what's behind the push to redraw congressional districts before the 2026 midterms. So a little bit of background on Justin. He returned to Loyola Law School after serving from 21 to 22 as the White House first senior policy advisor for democracy and voting rights.
It's going
There
great.
he assisted, yeah, there
Going
he
great.
assisted. Yeah, it's going great. Well, it's not your fault right now. You did good work while you were there, trying to make sure that every eligible American has secure, reliable access to a meaningful vote, to provide equitable representation in government and restore trust in democracy, and to try to bolster the ways by which we all try to build community and engage in civic participation. We can have another conversation about how that's all changed in the last couple of years, but um, the work you did was fantastic. You've been in federal government before as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division in the US DOJ, where you primarily supported the work that they do on voting rights and protections against employment discrimination. So Justin, welcome and thank you for being here for your second visit to
I
Election
am
Science Office.
delighted to be a return guest. Thanks so much for having me, Mike.
Great. It's great to have you here again. And I just want to make sure that folks know that you appeared before on April 17th, and we discussed the impact of the executive orders and a lot of things that had been going on from the federal government with respect to election administration. And if you missed that session, I strongly encourage you to go to our website or go to YouTube and find it because it was a fantastic conversation. Justin did a fantastic job just laying out the executive orders and their implications and some of the things that may or may not impede or speed up their ability to implement those. And we'll have to return to that too at some point. I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation between the two of us. So let's start with the headline here. So why is Texas redrawing their congressional district map?
Because they can, essentially. There is no federal prohibition, despite my efforts, despite a lot of efforts, despite a couple congressional bills floating around for at least 20 years. There's no federal law against redrawing districts mid-decade. Um, Many states have put prohibitions into effect, more for their state legislative lines than for Congress, but it's really up to state law. And state law says in Texas they can redraw whenever they want. The other impetus is because the president asked them to.
Mhm.
And there it's actually less clear whether they can or not. So Texas is redrawing. I think it's abundantly clear, despite a pretty shoddy letter from the Department of Justice that
Mhm.
serves mostly as some flimsy pretext. I think it's clear they're drawing because they want the state to look more Republican, to look quite a bit more Republican. It was already fairly gerrymandered at the beginning of the decade. They're trying to see if they can squeeze five more seats out. And that's unconstitutional. That's actually illegal. But in 2019, the Supreme Court took federal courts out of the process. So the even though shoplifting is still illegal, the cops posted a notice that says we're not watching this store anymore. And I think a bunch of Texas legislators have conflated what is permitted with who's going to stop me. and are
Mhm.
preparing right now to violate their oaths of office. So they can draw mid-decade because the law allows it. Um, they can't lawfully draw an excessive partisan gerrymander, but because the courts are out of the picture and
Mhm.
because Congress has taken itself out of the picture, the adults have left the room. And so they've made the calculation that no enforcement body is going to stop them there either.
And so by redrawing these districts, they think they can get 5 Republican seats. And that would get them hopefully to the point where they would not lose the House of Representatives. Is that the politics behind this?
I think that's the thought behind it. I think the word hopefully there is doing an awful lot of work. So
Mhm.
right now, if you knew nothing else about the landscape, um, it's 2026 coming up. That's a midterm election. The party of the president usually does pretty poorly in a midterm election, just as a sort of standard, basically law of politics. On top of that, the president is wildly unpopular right now, historically unpopular, and his party is running on a legislative achievement, on a signature bill that is itself wildly unpopular. So if you knew nothing other than those three things, you would think this would be a wave year for Democrats, and it might be. I think that the president wants to hedge against that as best he can. So he's trying to get seats wherever he can. And Texas, the House is, as you know, incredibly narrowly divided at the moment. And I think the president is seeking every possible advantage that he can get, including encouraging Texas to redraw the lines to eke out another 5 seats. Is that going to be enough? Who knows? Um,
Mhm.
will that actually be a 5 seat swing? Who knows? The map
Mhm.
right now is predicated on the electorate looking a lot like it did in 2020 or 2024 when Trump was on the ballot.
Mhm.
If President Trump is not on the ballot, and you get an electorate that looks more like 2018, that map
Mhm.
performs a little less well. And I gotta say, the current mix of policy has a complicated impact on the
Mhm.
Latino population in Texas. Latinos have been
Mhm.
trending Republican. Some really like the current mix of policy, some really, really don't.
Mhm.
And how that gets expressed at the ballot box and who chooses to show up could make the electorate either more Republican friendly or more Democrat friendly than 2018, even. So, how well this map performs for Republicans, I think depends on a
Mhm.
lot of assumptions. 26 elections a long time away. We'll see how they pan out. The voters are in charge here, so we'll see what they say about the environment.
So you think that there's some actual considerable risk here for the Republicans in Texas, that this could actually backfire on them in Texas.
Sort of. I think they've been very careful not to measurably impair the baseline. So
Mhm.
when they've drawn there are redistricting maps that Bernie Groffman notably called dummy manders, where you try and slice your margins so thin that it ends up backfiring. And I don't
Mhm.
think they've made any Republican district worse
Mhm.
by what they've done. So they've been very strategic. Again, unconstitutional, not okay, but very strategic in how they've drawn these lines. That
Mhm.
said, a wave is a wave is a wave, and the size of the wave may really impact the number of seats they've gained, anywhere
Mhm.
from 5 to 3 to 0 to a few negative. I don't know that the Republicans have intentionally or have drawn the map in a way that would make things measurably worse for them than they were before. But
Mhm.
there are some pretty marginal districts in Texas even before that if the Latino electorate either turns out differently or makes different choices when they turn out,
Mhm.
um, could well mean a big shift in Texas electoral fortunes.
Mhm. Okay, so that's super interesting. Now, one of the things you reminded me of is that sometimes I guess I don't pay as much attention to history as I should. This is not the first time this has happened in
Indeed.
Texas.
Yeah, it's the worst edition of Groundhog Day you've ever seen. Uh, 20 years ago, Texas redrew the lines in the middle of the decade. Now, then at least there was the argument that
Mhm.
an initial map had been drawn by a court. The legislature hadn't gotten its chance to draw the lines. Here, no such thing. The legislature drew the lines that it wanted 4 years ago. And there, at least 20 years ago, there was the argument that the previous map had been a Democratic gerrymander with some reason behind it. The
Mhm.
Democrats had drawn a map that was resistant to the way the state was trending. Here, no such argument now, right? The existing map is a bit of a Republican gerrymander, and the new one is a lot of a Republican gerrymander. But even
Mhm.
so, this was chaos 20 years ago. Texas
Mhm.
Democrats fled the state twice, much like what you're seeing now in a quorum break. The
Mhm.
legislators were originally put on a bus to Port Charles, Louisiana, which is a little bit of a casino town, or at least that's what the legislators were told.
Uh-huh.
Instead, they were actually going the other direction to Ardmore, Oklahoma, where they camped out in a motel. It's still the source of the best lead for a student paper I have ever heard of, and I wish that it were one of my students. It wasn't. It was the inimitable Samus Akaroff told this story. A student
Uh-huh.
started a paper with the following lines. Historically, there have been many reasons why middle-aged men sneak into a motel late at night. Until now, redistricting has not been one of them.
That is great.
The whole
That's an A plus
enterprise,
right there.
Tom DeLay got in trouble using the FAA to track a plane of Texas legislators. Willie Nelson sent a case of Jack Daniels to the motel the second time around. It was the whole thing was a mess.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, we don't seem to have learned a lot from that mess because it's a mess again. Texas has some real legislative items on the agenda, including flood relief, that
Mhm.
it has absolutely tanked any prospect of accomplishing
Mhm.
because they've decided to put this partisan land grab first. And as a result, driven Democrats out of the state in a seriously complicated ethical question, right?
Mhm.
That if there are no other means to enforce the federal constitution, if the courts are AWOL, if Congress is AWOL, then refusing to do your job as a legislator by showing up may be the
Mhm.
only way to do your job as a legislator to uphold the Constitution.
Mhm.
That's not a great scenario for anybody, for any member of a legislator trying to serve their constituents.
Mhm. So my understanding is the latest is that it sounds like Governor Abbott is going to call a close to this current special session, but then call for a second special section, I guess, in session in the hopes that these Democratic legislators return to the state. I mean, what's the prospects of that happening?
I think so. He's trying to effectively wait them out.
Hmm.
And every day that the legislators aren't in Texas, there are real costs. There are costs to them for their homes and families. There are fines that they're having to pay. They got to be living out of state. The media coverage can turn,
Hmm.
depending on how the media is portraying the fight. And I think it is not a quorum break is not cost free. 20
Hmm.
years ago, when the Democrats broke quorum twice, they eventually came back. And I think that's what the governor is counting on. Now, I'll say in the meantime, the Democrats who've broken quorum have gotten a lot of attention on the
Hmm.
problem, including the attention of some other states that may be contemplating whether to retaliate and how and what to do about the thing when Texas legislators come back.
Hmm. So that's a great segue. So California is one of those states, and our
There it is.
very own Governor Newsom, who we believe is probably running for president, certainly is seizing the limelight here, and threatening to redraw California's districts. Um, so I can just ask the question, and then we can use it as a way to get into the conversation. So why is California doing this?
Because the adults have left the room.
Hmm.
Because there's nothing else stopping Texas from doing it. If the federal courts are out of commission, if the state courts don't seem likely to uphold constitutional values, if Congress isn't going to act, then what you're seeing is a little bit of, well, right now you're seeing nuclear deterrence.
Hmm.
And what I think we're about to see is what happens after first launch.
Hmm.
So it's a little bit of retribution. I will still hope there's still time for the car to swerve. There's still time not to get there. And I will hope that everybody stands down. But you're watching the Cuban Missile Crisis, and one of the countries is about to launch.
Mhm.
And I think that's part of why California is contemplating a range of options to respond. If Texas is going to break the Constitution for partisan favoritism, I think that the state with the largest number of congressional districts and certainly the largest number of Republican seats under Democratic control wants to be able to respond, even if that means breaking the Constitution itself. None of this, I should add, absolutely none of this is good for voters. You get a little bit of sense in the coverage of the day that
Mhm.
people who follow the horse race is sort of salivating over this brutal partisan fight. But the people who lose in this are the voters across the board. Where voters have had the opportunity to take power to draw the lines, both state and federal, away from politicians, they've done it. Where ballot
Mhm.
initiatives are possible, there have been a number, more recently, the trend is
Mhm.
decidedly the other direction, of voters taking power away from politicians to draw the lines because they recognize that they'd rather be represented by communities, they'd rather be represented by the sort of issues they have in mind, and not just by a D or an R. And I think it's really important to note that this has been abundantly bipartisan, that Democratic voters have taken power away from Democratic officials, Republican voters have taken power away from Republican officials. California and Colorado and Michigan have done it on the more Democratic side, and Idaho and Montana and most recently Utah have done it on the Republican side. This is not a partisan thing. This is a voters preferring to be in charge thing and not liking what happens when incumbents draw the lines for their own benefit, to benefit their friends and punish their enemies. And so the fact that California is contemplating responding to what Texas is doing should not give anyone particular glee. This is a mess.
Mhm.
And I am a Gen X kid and grew up watching The Day After and wanting very much not to live through nuclear fallout. I
Mhm.
don't think anybody benefits from what's coming next.
So the background here, the impediment in California is California is not Texas, right?
Correct.
Especially when it comes to the ability to redraw district lines. And that's because in California, as you've noted, we have this independent commission that that's taken the power of redistricting out of the hands of our state legislature, which is largely Democratic, put it in the hands of a bunch of citizens, some of whom we know, right? Some of whom are our colleagues, right?
Mhm.
And they've drawn these district lines in what looks like a very fair and pretty equitable way. Um, and what Governor Newsom's current plan is to essentially eliminate that from our state's constitution temporarily somehow via a ballot measure. I mean, the details of this are all kind of unclear and a bit
Right.
sketchy. Um, but what do you think about that plan? Is that really a good idea, not just for California voters in the California process, but just in general for these kind of independent commissions?
None of this is a good idea. Flat out, none of it. Um, I would wish for Texas that they got themselves an independent commission. By the way, Illinois, where the Texas Democrats are currently camping out, California may not be Texas, but Illinois looks an awful lot like Texas. They're already slightly gerrymandered. They could be even more gerrymandered, and there are very few state rules standing in the way of that. As you note, California took a different path. California has set up constitutional safeguards for the benefit of the voters and the communities that get represented. And it's not a good idea to do away with those safeguards, but it is understandable in the current atmosphere. And the notion that Texas is seeking to gain a partisan advantage by breaking the law, it is, again, not good. I'm not cheering for it, but it is understandable that California would want to respond in kind. There are
Mhm.
better and worse ways of doing this if we're going to do it. And there are ways that the California voters, I think, might seriously reject. So,
Mhm.
because the commission, full of people who have taken their jobs very seriously, like jurors sitting on a jury, who take their jobs very seriously when real cases are in front of them, they've drawn lines to benefit California voters and to benefit California communities and sort of let the partisanships fall where they may, rather than designing districts for incumbents or designing districts for partisan gain. Um, California is one of the very few states that didn't get sued at the
Mhm.
beginning of the decade. And everybody gets sued. I mean, one of the absolute truisms is that death, taxes, and redistricting litigation come around reliably at the beginning of every decade. Um, and California is one of the few states that escaped that. In part, I think that's a testament to how hard the commissioners worked in order to draw lines that corresponded to the law. Um,
Mhm.
I don't think California voters who put Prop 20 in place in 2010 with, I think the vote was something like 62% in favor, big bipartisan majority. I don't think California voters want to do away with the commission, period. Um, I think, we're the bear republic, and I think Texas may just have poked the bear enough to get California voters interested in something more temporary and more contingent.
Mhm.
And it's possible. I think that California cannot change the map without changing the Constitution. But I think it would be possible, and I think California voters might be in the mood to change the Constitution to allow, as you said, as you suggested, a temporary contingent assignment of authority away from the commission. Um,
Mhm.
if we're going to do this, I think the cleanest thing is to make a clean break, is to not pretend to do something that's half commissiony, not to
Mhm.
pretend to put this in the zone of in the public good. It's not. And I think that it's most obvious when you say exceptional measure, exceptional time. This is not how we do normally. We're going to do this now for a very specific reason and then return to normal business afterward. Um, will the California voters go for that? I don't know. But that to me, I think is an easier sell than doing away with a commission that's been working really well for Californians for the last 20 years.
Yeah, I think Newsom is making some big assumptions here, that California voters will go along with this, just because of their concerns about the Republicans in Congress and President Trump and many of the things that he's done that have impacted California. I'd have to agree with you. It's not at all clear to me that California voters would support this kind of temporary change, and it also sounds as if folks, including former Governor Schwarzenegger, might step up and campaign against this ballot measure. Governor Schwarzenegger was one of the main proponents of the independent commission in the first place.
Oh, I think you will see a very well-financed, very vigorous campaign against, regardless.
Mhm.
Um, it really, like I said, it really depends on how angry California voters are at what's going on in Texas and or elsewhere.
Mhm.
And I don't think you should take that for granted that they're angry enough to even temporarily do away with a system that's been treating that well. Yeah, I think former Governor Schwarzenegger is likely to get involved. I think Charlie Munger, who funded a big
Mhm.
portion of the initial initiatives, is likely to get involved. I think you'll see a lot of money poured into a campaign to try and convince California citizens that they shouldn't abandon a system that's been working well. And against that, you're going to see an awful lot of money trying to convince California voters that even if that's true, what Texas is doing now is a real problem and needs a response.
So it could all backfire on Governor Newsom. That would be
I
very
think
interesting.
he's calculating that the appearance of putting up a fight
Mhm.
is to his political benefit regardless.
Mhm.
And also, I mean, I suspect this is sincere. I think he'd like to win, but um, I think he's calculating that it's not likely to backfire on him, particularly given his other ambitions,
Mhm.
um, to be seen as fighting. I think if he decided to do away with the commission permanently, if that were the choice put to voters, I think that would backfire. I think
Mhm.
California, as ticked off as California voters may be right now, I don't think they want to abandon the institutions that have been serving them well.
Mhm.
Whether they have the stomach for a temporary carve out in response to deeply unusual times,
Mhm.
closer question.
So I want to just also circle back for a sec, just to make sure that I and I think folks who are listening to this kind of got the point about your opinion about the cleanest thing to do here, which is to just be honest about it and just have a simple ballot measure that would simply repeal the independent commission, and then we deal with it later if we want to go back to it, right? Have
Yeah,
another ballot measure to bring it back.
and well, so that would be clean. I don't think the voters would go for it. So a
Mhm.
straight up repeal, I think, is something the voters aren't likely to tolerate. They worked really hard to put this commission in place. There was
Mhm.
the big bipartisan majority in favor of it. And so I would think that would be clean for sure, but I think that would fail. Um, I think the second cleanest and something that might have a chance of succeeding is an amendment to the Constitution that says Article 21, which is where the independent commission sits,
Mhm.
applies, except if there's a finding that another state has
Mhm.
drawn districts mid-decade for excessive partisan gain, in which case some other body, presumably the legislature, has the authority to draw lines for a particular period. And that's it.
Mhm.
It would be a carve out um, that would amend the Constitution,
Right.
but temporary and contingent. There are a number of other proposals that I've heard floated, and most of these are trial
Mhm.
balloons. I want to emphasize I have no particular insight into what the governor's plans are or what the legislature's plans are. Um, I've heard a number of different things floated that are various iterations of putting a map on the ballot. And
Mhm.
all of those get more complicated and or are illegal. And so, depending on the iteration, I mean, they range from definitely not okay to maybe okay, but why would you chance it? Um, right now, the authority lives with a body that's not the legislature. And if you're going to change it, I think the cleanest way to do that is to change it. And yes, be honest about it. You only get to make these changes for uh, under very specific conditions.
Mhm.
And by the way, if the goal is deterrence. If the real goal is let's do this so that nobody ever has to go through this again, then I think the break should be not only confined in its own sandbox, but clear. You want full retaliation? Let there
Mhm.
be no rules. Other than the Voting Rights Act, Federal Voting Rights Act is still law, and I deeply believe that communities of color should not bear the brunt of this partisan nonsense. Um, the Federal law doesn't have a lot of other requirements other than one member per district. That includes the fact that federal law doesn't require districts to be contiguous.
Mhm.
So you really want to do this, do it for real. Make it possible for districts to be drawn that are smiley faces. Make it possible for a bit of San Francisco to be put in the Inland Empire. Show people what real partisan warfare looks like.
Mhm.
And part of my reason for suggesting that is the hope that it finally serves as smelling salts to shake Congress out of its stupor,
Mhm.
to get real legislation saying, okay, nobody gets to do this again. I mean,
Mhm.
if we're in the Cuban Missile Crisis, I don't think half measures are warranted. And so in this sandbox, in this temporary contingent zone, I think there's some logic to taking all the gloves off.
Mhm. I like your analogy here to, mutual assured destruction and just like nuclear deterrence, because um, our colleague Bob Page down in Orange County has been pretty vocal on social media recently about the many impediments logistically, right, to actually getting a ballot measure put forward, getting on the ballot, calling a special election, and then assuming that it passes, all of the things that would have to happen for our county election officials to implement these new maps in time for our primaries, which are just months off in 2026.
Yeah,
So I want to talk about that logistics, but I also want to say, given all of Governor Newsom has to know that the logistical problems. So I just do really wonder if this isn't brinksmanship really on his part, and that does he really intend to do this, or is it just like playing politics and trying to fight fire with
I
fire
would
with respect to Texas and Trump.
I would hope that he doesn't really intend to do this if Texas backs down.
Mm,
And I would hope that he would show himself to be sufficiently serious that Texas would back down. I wish I saw more signs of Texas backing down than I do. And I think he actually is serious about doing this if Texas goes forward,
mhm,
despite the impediments, despite the fact that it's not trivial. I do say that the timing and the logistics are their own concern and separate from should we be doing this at all. Um,
mhm,
there's a current statute that says you need 148 days between a call for a special election and a special election. Now, that's a statute. Legislature can change that law, just like it can put forward an amendment to the Constitution. Um, but that statute exists for a reason, and that's because calling a special election isn't trivial. You need to get ready for one, and you need to run it, and you need election officials able to do that work. And
mhm,
compressing that timeline comes with real costs. Um, I the governor has floated a November date for special election. I will confess, I'm not entirely sure why, because I don't think this has to happen in November. Um, there's a timing crunch on the front end, and then there's a timing crunch on the back end, right? There's a timing crunch in having the election, and then a timing crunch in implementing if the election succeeds, if the ballot
mhm,
measure does actually pass and it gives authority to somebody else to draw the lines, which not a foregone conclusion. Um, if a ballot measure gave the legislature the chance to redraw lines, the legislature doesn't have to wait to draw the lines for that measure. It can be working in the meantime and have a map that's ready to pass the moment that the ballot measure is certified. But that
mhm,
still takes time to implement for the primaries. Primary schedule can also be moved. That's not set in stone. Um, and I think that rather than, I think moving the primaries and giving
mhm,
everybody a little bit more space to actually implement, both on the back end and on the front end,
mhm,
would make everyone's life easier. Even if moving the primaries amounts to a significant change, it's a change that's far enough away that election officials can actually do that. There's room in the 26 calendar, and plenty of other states have elections that are where the primary is closer together. Um, but there have to be some decisions made quickly about whether to do that and how to do that, including whether to have the special election in November or whether to have the special election at some point in, January or February. If the governor called the special election today under existing laws without changing anything, you could have that special election in the second week of January.
mhm.
And you could have a map, again, if that passed, the day after that election were certified. If the results of the election were clear even before certification, you could effectively have election officials working to implement that map the day
Mhm.
after the election were held.
Yeah, I mean this has sort of been as I've been looking at some of the concerns that Bob Page and other election officials have been raising about the timing. I've been thinking, well, yeah, there could be also a package of temporary changes that the legislature would introduce and probably pass that could move a lot of these dates and requirements around. I could imagine like the scenario you just outlined, having the special election, early in 2026, but pushing the primaries on into the summer, right?
Mhm.
There's no reason why that couldn't happen, and that probably would be what we'd probably see.
And plenty of
Uh,
states did exactly that in and around the pandemic,
right.
which was a much bigger disruption and managed those different calendars, I would say, just fine. Now, that all comes with costs, and this is not a friendly fiscal environment for anybody. But I think that's more doable than trying to cram a pretty complicated ballot initiative process and a pretty complicated electoral structure into the current calendar.
So, those of you who are watching with us live, if you do have questions, you can go down to the Q&A tab and click there and type your questions. And I do want to turn to a couple of the questions that we've gotten, and also just want to thank our colleague Morgan Kauser, who's asked some of these really great questions for joining us today. Morgan, it's wonderful that you're with us today. So
Amen.
Morgan asked, yeah, if California passes a constitutional amendment and successfully flips 5 seats to the Democrats, and then in 2031 Texas draws an even more extreme gerrymander, what then do California and the other states with commissions do?
So this is part of the reason why, if we're gonna do this, and again, I am not advocating that we do this, that we don't do it halfway. In part because I want the chaos to convince Congress that it has to act. And
Mhm.
Congress came 2 votes from passing legislation on this in 2022. Passed the House, came 2 votes from passing the Senate. So there's an existing model for actually doing this. Um, I don't know why California is thinking about 5 seats. Again, I can't, it's unconstitutional to draw for excessive partisan reasons, right? So take as a given that the voters have already decided that they want to break the Constitution. If we're gonna break the glass, break the glass. And if you draw districts that aren't contiguous, then I think without harming any community of color, you can draw California entirely blue.
Mhm.
If you draw, I mean, the districts, when I say not contiguous, I mean, it is lawful to take a household where one person votes Republican and one person votes Democrat and put them in different districts. That's not anything we've seen before. That seems nuts. And I guess what I'm advocating is if you're gonna go nuts enough to force Congress to act, precisely because we shouldn't be having this conversation in 2031. We shouldn't be having it now. So I think that Illinois could turn its entire congressional delegation blue. I think that California could turn its entire congressional delegation blue. I think that Maryland could do the same thing. I think that other states are unfortunately looking to undo some of the progress they have made toward more independence, like New York, and thinking about constitutional change there. Um, I, if we're going to have a one-time departure from the sensible way of doing things, I want it significant enough that it finally forces the only decision maker, now that the federal courts have decided they're out of this picture, the only decision maker that can set national rules to set national rules.
Mhm.
Because
Okay, so
the state by state warfare that happens otherwise,
yeah.
again, it doesn't end well for any of the voters. And I worry there's not really anything in the way of every state going nuclear all the time in every
Time.
place if Congress doesn't act.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's what Morgan's really asking about here, right? So now he has another real specific question about Texas,
Mhm.
and I will let you answer this one because you know much more about Texas than I do. Morgan asks, all of the Texas targets are minorities, as Dylan's letter and Abbott's response emphasize. How much of an opening does this give to voting rights plaintiffs to make racial gerrymandering claims in federal court?
So it is, as is typical with Morgan, an extremely good question. The DOJ sent in a letter that I think itself violates the law because I think it's so shoddy it can't be understood as anything other than partisan pretext. I've testified to exactly this. I think it's a violation of the Hatch Act. Um, it claimed that Texas should redraw the lines now because of purported constitutional problems. Now, I think that's nonsense. But there are actually still federal laws around the use of race, including the intentional drawing of districts to dilute uh, the power of communities of color, to dilute based on racial lines, and including the intentional moving of people into or out of a district predominantly based on race without good enough reason. That doctrine has gotten increasingly ornate of late.
Mhm.
The Supreme Court has kind of tied itself in some knots. And the short version is I think that the facts around the proposed map in Texas provide a lot of really good claims about unconstitutional action on the basis of race, about claims against the Voting Rights Act on the basis of race, and proving those facts in a court turns out to be another matter entirely.
Mhm.
Texas has been locked in vicious litigation for the last 4 years. As Morgan, I suspect, knows, I'd be surprised if you weren't involved in that litigation. Uh, since the 21 maps were passed, Texas has been stuck in a case that actually went to a 4-week trial this June. So plaintiffs and federal judges have been working for 4 years on the existing maps. Now Texas is redrawing the lines, causing
Mhm.
everybody to pull out the hair, including those of us who have no hair left. Um, the court has made it, the Supreme Court has made it so that when justice comes, it comes slowly and it comes with delay. Um,
Mhm.
and while there are still avenues to cut that short, there aren't any avenues dependable enough to guarantee that litigation will work before the clock runs out on the next election. I think Texas has
Mhm.
been counting on this in the litigation so far. They've managed to stall long enough to work through at least 2 election cycles. Um, I think it's very, while I would wish that these suits were clearer and cleaner and judges were willing to act faster, I
Mhm.
think you will see plaintiffs run to court immediately. And I think you'll see Texas stall, 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 stall. And I am not at all convinced that even though there's substantive liability,
Mhm.
that plaintiffs would be able to get an injunction in court before the 26 elections take place, which is, I think, exactly what Texas is counting on.
Mhm.
This is exactly the reason why Congress passed the preclearance provisions in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in the original version. Exactly this ability of states to stall and
Mhm.
therefore delay justice and therefore deny justice to plaintiffs that kept having to chase an electoral calendar is exactly why the Congress flipped the burden in the states with the biggest representational problems. And I don't think, if you look at the states that right now today are still fighting over district lines for Congress, where there is
Mhm.
litigation going on today, August 13th,
Mhm.
litigation over congressional district lines. Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, Utah, and Wisconsin. I think I got all of them there. Um, add Mississippi in if you want to add state legislative lines.
Mhm.
7 out of the 9 states still fighting over Congress are in the Deep South and
Mhm.
were states that were formerly subject to preclearance. And I don't think that's a coincidence. The
Mhm.
states that had historically the biggest problems with fair representation are, it turns out, to nobody's surprise, the states with the biggest problems in fair representation. And the problems that plaintiffs have in actually getting relief in a timely fashion are exactly why preclearance was so essential and really make manifest the damage done when the Supreme Court tossed out that ability to stop discrimination before it takes effect in 2013 in the Shelby County case.
Mhm.
So
What about,
Morgan's absolutely right
yeah,
that the new Texas maps make Texas good for it,
right.
that they should be stopped, but I'm not confident that the clock will allow it before we get to holding elections.
Okay. So what about California though? Or other states that are responding? Um, Obviously, if California were to move forward, I would suspect that there'd be litigation on the ballot measure itself, on whatever changes the legislature wanted to implement to try to make this all work. If it passes, there would probably be litigation as well. Are you as pessimistic on the prospects there for successful litigation against what California may be doing? And we don't really know what California is going to do, so it's
Right.
really hypothetical, right? But
Yeah. And I
assuming
think
that
it
we
depends.
know.
Yeah,
Okay.
it depends a ton on how California does what it does. If
Mhm.
California decides to pass both a clean timing provision, right?
Mhm.
So that the special elections aren't contrary to the timing in current law, so that they consist they're consistent with current law, and passes a clean ballot initiative, changing the Constitution and to whom it gives authority to draw lines, even temporary or contingent, then I think litigation is not likely to be successful, because California has the ability to change up the Constitution as it wishes. I think different versions of that get very messy, and I would think that litigation would have a better chance if you put a map on the ballot rather than changing the identity of the line drawers. I might give litigation, like I might bet more heavily that litigation would be successful. If you put a map on the ballot along with a change in who gets to draw the lines, California, like every other state with an initiative provision, has a single subject rule. It says you can only have one initiative that changes one subject at a time. It's meant to stop log rolling. It's meant to stop, we'll give you all the candy in the world if only you do this thing that you don't like. And I'm not at all sure that the courts would let an initiative go forward with both a change to who draws the lines and a proposed map. It
Mhm.
Courts are notoriously fickle at these single subject requirements. So the answer there is really who knows. And other complicated versions of how to run the ballot initiative run into their own legal risks depending on what the actual thing looks like. So you're right, we don't know. Um, there are ways to do this that could well get the process tied up in courts and could get the process tied up in court long enough that you lose the chance to actually do the clean thing.
Mhm.
So it's part of what I'm sure the governor and his staff and the legislature and their staff are considering. I think that there's a comparatively clean way to run the initiative that runs into fewer legal problems and comparatively dirtier ways to run the initiative that could well run into legal problems. And I don't think the California state courts are likely to indulge nonsense. They're
Mhm.
not operating on partisan principles. They're operating on a different set of what drives them. And so
Mhm.
I don't think they're just going to rubber stamp whatever the legislature decides to do. I think they'll look carefully at what current law requires to see whether what the legislature decides to do is in comports with current law.
Mhm. Well, we've been going for 50 minutes and I promised you 45, but I do want to ask you just one more question. So if this all sorts starts to happen, like Texas does redraw their districts, California, perhaps, Illinois, New York, produce new maps. Those maps are used in the 2026 election. We have an election. We have no idea, obviously, how that election would turn out. Okay. But do you think that given this gerrymandering and really this sort of blatant manipulation of the rules of the election that we've really kind of never seen before in the United States, do you think that that's going to have what effect is that going to have on voter confidence and trust?
It's not great. The people who lose under this scenario are the voters, are we the people. Going back to my Gen X heritage, um, I learned in war games that the only way to win is not to play.
Mhm.
And the computer figured that out, just took in a minute. I will hope that the voters can help politicians figure that out before we actually get here. There's still time to swerve to avoid the driving the car off the cliff.
Mhm.
We're getting awful close. We're getting uncomfortably close. Um, I think that, look, districts are really important. They're not always determinative, particularly in wave years. And I still think that the energy of the electorate at the moment is high. I think this will be a high turnout 26 election. And I think there are some scenarios in which voters can overcome districts into which they are drawn for partisan purposes on one side or the other, right? People are sufficiently ticked off that I think you'll get infrequent midterm voters showing up in a way that confounds expectations. But it's awfully hard to steer faster uphill when the districts have been drawn with that much vertical gain. It's hard to overcome districts that have been drawn specifically to engineer a final result. That's exactly why California voters put the commission in charge in the first place, is they
Mhm.
were tired of this. I think that the voters would be far better off if there were nationwide impetus to make the lines fairer, either by
Mhm.
institution or by substantive rules, or both, or neither, or by changing the method of election. There are lots of different ways to go and lots of different models for Congress to do this. Um, but the one thing that's clear to me is that the voters don't win at the end of this particular fight, regardless. Does that mean that the voters won't show up? I don't think so.
Mhm.
The electorate right now feels this. These are now vibes. We're now far from the world of law. But the vibe feels angry. The vibe
Mhm.
feels frustrated. The vibe feels like voters know that they want control back
Mhm.
and want to reassert that control. And so as much as I think the voters lose by pure partisan warfare taking place in drawing the district lines, I think you're still going to see a lot of voters show up to express that anger in November of 26.
Mhm. I agree with you. And I'm going to end it on that note, and just thank you for joining us again. And note that, we're in very crazy and trying political times, and I really want to thank you for spending some time with me to just help a lot of us just try to make sense of what's going on. Your insights are really, really remarkable.
And it's been a profound pleasure. What people are watching right now, what we're all watching right now, is what happens when the rule of law breaks down. People turn to self-help. And you're watching the states increasingly turn to self-help. I think you might see voters turn to self-help. It's part of why the rule of law is so very important. And I am hoping we get it back on much firmer footing than we seem to be on at the moment very, very soon. And thank you for helping people understand the importance of doing that.
Thanks. And I'm sure we'll be talking again in a couple of weeks, just
I
because,
look
again,
forward to round three.
it's crazy times. But thank you, and have a great day.
Thanks, Mike.